People arrive hours early for church. On Sabbath mornings, they don't just set a backup alarm clock to assure they wake in time. They set up a backup for the backup. They arrange their schedules to make sure they don't miss gatherings for worship. Throughout the week, they talk about what happened the previous Sabbath as excitement builds for the upcoming church service. There are all-day talk shows on the radio devoted to reviewing last week's service and breaking down the next one. There's a TV show called Church Center that runs highlight clips of church activities that happen across the nation. When Sabbath comes, the members start loading up their trucks, SUVs, and sedans hours before the service starts. "Hurry," says Dad frantically. "We're behind again." "It's 6 a.m., said Mom. "Church doesn't start for hours. Last time we left at this time, we had to park 3 miles from the sanctuary and sit in the nosebleed seats. Someday, I just want to sit in the front row, but you have to camp out on the church lawn to have any chance of that." The roads are really congested on the way to church, no matter how early you leave. At church, there are vehicles parked as far as the eye can see, and folks are out tailgating. Some have elaborate spreads prepared, breaking out portable grills and lawn chairs in the church parking lot. Some have television monitors and satellite dishes so they can catch updates from other worship services while they wait for their own. It's nice weather today, not that it matters. Even in the dead of winter, they'll be out there in the same numbers. The masses begin filling into the sanctuary and cheering with great passion and excitement. Once the service starts, the people are all on their feet, not that they ever sit down. Of course, a bunch of young guys are in the front row. They've probably been here since Friday night. They have no shirts, and each one has a letter on his chest. Together they spell out, "Get your tithe on." Apparently, the rumor has gotten out that the sermon is going to be on biblical stewardship and worshiping God with our money. Everyone is pumped for the giving sermon. It's one of the highlights of the year. After several hours, people start looking at their watches, and they're all thinking the same thing. I hope this sermon goes into overtime. Amen. Somebody in first service says, "You wish." We have a culture of worship. We just don't have a culture of worshiping God. We have an awful lot of little g gods out there that people are worshiping with great energy. And the Bible talks about it, and we kind of miss it because in the Bible, it's always talking about little pieces of wood and stone, and somehow we are sophisticated enough to understand the whole Bible except the part about transferring pieces of wood and stone to pieces of paper and silicone. The text today is from Joshua chapter 24, the last chapter of Joshua. You remember this is Joshua's farewell speech to the people of Israel. Joshua is the guy that went into the land and came out and said, "Look, that land is crawling with giants. That land is a land of flowing with milk and honey. It's a great place to be. And if God gave it to us, I say we walk right in and we get it." Unfortunately, there were some dissenters. And the dissenters prevailed on the day. So Joshua spent 40 years in the wilderness with them all. He spent 40 years going through all those trials. And then he brought them up with Moses to the threshold, to the river's edge. And there they defeated 3 kings on the east side of the Jordan. And God built their confidence and built their trust. And then he crossed the Jordan with them. They took Jericho. They took city after city after city. They defeated enemy after enemy. And after they had gotten, this was really Joshua's mission accomplished speech. Remember George Bush on the deck of the ship? Sign behind him, mission accomplished. There was still a lot of mopping up to be done. There were still enemies in the land. They had not crushed the Philistines. A lot was yet to be done, but he was saying, this is the end of my leadership for you. And he says in verse 13, and he tells their history in verses 1 through 12, and he says, I have given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build, and you dwell in them, and you eat of the vineyards and the olive groves which you did not plant. Now therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now the people responded to him and they said, sure, that's great. We would never serve any other God. This is the God that brought us out. We'll do all this, no problem. And he said to the people in verse 19, you cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God, a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and do you harm and consume you after he has done you good. And the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. An interesting standoff. We are hardwired to worship. We will worship something. It is not a question of if, it is a question of what. We will worship something. And I'll tell you, if you look in the newspaper, if you look on the internet, if you look at your neighbors and your coworkers, everybody's worshiping different things, and there are some really bizarre things out there that people worship. The most amazing one of them all that people worship is themselves. It's funny to think that you could worship yourself after you got yourself into this mess. So I was a teenager, and my parents took on a foreign exchange student from Tokyo. Her name was Yoko. And Yoko is one of those people, anybody here has ever moved to a country where you didn't know the language? There's a bunch of you here, right? So she was from Japan. And Japanese is a totally foreign language to English. And she thought she spoke English when she was in Japan, but the night she came and got off the airplane and got into our car, we could not understand one word that she said. Now, I was raised in the Bible Belt in a Seventh-day Adventist church. I had memorized the Ten Commandments. I understood what the Ten Commandments meant. I had even studied the iconic schism of the Orthodox Church. Everybody knows that there was a time when there was a big fight in the Middle Ages over whether or not they were going to venerate icons. Everybody remember this? What do they teach in those schools? Anyway, iconoclasm, that's what they do. They teach them. Well, not those schools anymore. But anyway, so classical literature, classical things, you got to learn these stuff. So there was a schism in the church because of that. Some people say schism. Either is permissible. So don't write me any letters. All right. So I understood this, okay? And so here comes Yoko, and she comes from a whole different background. She's heard of what Christianity is, but she doesn't have any clue. And so she's trying to tell us a little bit about herself, and we're trying to pull it out of her. And it turns out her passion is rock and roll, and we got that from her. That rock and roll, she was a rock and roll drummer. She loved rock and roll. And she said she loved the Beaters. And it took us several tries to figure out she meant the Beatles. And we said, you like the Beatles? So do we. And she said, yes, they're my iders. And we said, idol. It took me a long time to figure out that she's saying it's my idol. See, in her culture, it was okay to say that. And apparently maybe in Oregon too. But here in the Bible Belt, you just don't say that. You just don't say that the Beatles are your idol. It was anathema. I caught my breath. I didn't want to be mean to this new visitor. I thought, my goodness, you worship idols. And now there's a television show called American Idol, which equally offends me. But anyway, not the show, the title. Okay, the show a little bit. So she had no qualms at all about talking about idols. And what I learned is that we would never say we worship idols. We just do it quietly. Because we do it. And I'm going to suggest to you, you can't break the other 9 commandments without worshiping idols. Worshiping idols, taking God off the throne, C.S. Lewis calls it disordered loves. Getting our loves out of order. Think about what that means. That means that we have a love priority order. And guess what? Your kids that you love so much, they're not on top. Guess what? Your spouse that you love so much is not on top. The ordered love is God first, for he is a jealous God. So, think about where these people are coming from. They're coming from Egypt. And even before Egypt, as Joshua says, your ancestors worship gods on the other side. He's talking about Abraham's ancestors. And they had idols. And he says the Egyptians had idols. In fact, we saw a big Egyptian idol crop up right at the foot of Mount Sinai, didn't we? So that's the bull. The bull was the power god in Egypt. But Egypt had hundreds of gods. We always think of Egypt as worshipers of the sun, Isis and all that. But Egypt had a whole litany, a very sophisticated litany of gods, and they worshiped hundreds and hundreds of gods, and they understood all these gods and what they did. And lest it be confused, they didn't worship the little emblems of their gods. Those emblems simply represented the gods they worshiped. The gods they worshiped weren't made of wood and stone. They were just icons of the real God. And so they had all these. And what did the children of Israel say at the foot of Sinai? They said, this calf is the God that brought us out of Egypt. So God at Sinai tries to explain to them what he's like. And he does this by giving them instructions on building a tabernacle. And this tabernacle, she's gone. The tabernacle teacher just walked out on me. Where'd she go? Okay, she's gone. Anyway, you tell her that I called her out, okay? You'll do that for me? So he gave them instructions on this tabernacle. And this tabernacle was to represent how heaven really is. And there was a place on the outside where people came, and there was a place that was even more special than that. And then there was another place that was so special that only one person ever got to go there, and then only once a year, not whenever he wanted to. And it was a very special place. And in that very special place was something that was very, very holy. It was a golden box. And on top of the golden box were 2 angels, and between the angels was a place made of gold that was empty called the mercy seat. So there is a throne with nothing on it. So here are all these people who for centuries have been worshiping images of gods, and they all make an image of the God they worship so they can remember who they're worshiping. And all of a sudden God explains to them, no, let me explain it to you. I am a real God. You don't have to have an image. I'll show you my throne. I'll let you build a throne for me, and that's where I will dwell among you. And it's a portable throne. It has poles, and you can pick it up, and you can carry it here, and you can carry it there, and I will go with you. Wherever we go together. And the people had trouble understanding it. An interesting thing happened in 1 Samuel chapter 4. As I mentioned, the people didn't totally get Joshua's speech. And they hadn't yet thrown the Philistines out. How many want Philistines? How many want Philistines? You like the Steens? Okay, we'll go with the Steens. It's a Jewish family. Anyway, so the Philistines. Samuel's words, this is 1 Samuel chapter 4. Samuel's words went out to all the people of Israel, and at that time Israel was at war with the Philistines. The Israelite army was camped near Ebenezer, and the Philistines were at Aphek. The Philistines attacked and defeated the army of Israel, killing 4,000 men. After the battle was over, the troops retreated to their camp, and the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord allow us to be defeated by the Philistines?" And then they said, "Let's bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh. If we carry it into battle with us, it will save us from our enemies." You see what they did? They made the box an idol for God. They said, the box will save us. If God won't save us, we'll turn to the box. And they carried the box, and you remember the disastrous consequences. It's a wonderful story, very wonderful story to read. It's the only reference to hemorrhoids in the Bible, and it's just really worth reading. So go home and read 1 Samuel chapter 4, 5, and 6. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful story. And so they lost the Ark of the Covenant. They lost God's presence with them because they chose to worship what God had given them instead of the God who gave it. Is there any other point to the book of Hosea than this? The whole book of Hosea, God tells Hosea, go marry a prostitute, and every time she goes off after her profession and she says something nice about her other fellas, you go back and get her back and say, they didn't give you that, honey, I gave you that. Explain that her gifts and her life comes from you, not them. And then you'll know how I, God, feel when my people stray away from me. Wow, powerful, powerful message. So here it comes. So it's not if, it's what. There's one more story I want to remind you of. In the New Testament, Jesus fed 5,000, it said, 5,000 men by the Sea of Galilee. And then if you read the rest of the story, you see how he snuck away? He sent the disciples on a boat, but he didn't go on the boat, and he went up to pray, and then he walked over later. Read the story. It's a very interesting story. And he snuck away from these people who had camped there that night and had a wonderful meal in the evening. I don't know if it was smoked fish or if it was sushi, but they had a wonderful meal of sushi and bread. And the next morning, guess what? They were hungry. And they said, where did they go? And they followed him around to the other side of the lake, and they found him. And it was, a whole morning's walk, and they get over there, and they're really hungry by this point. And when they get there, Jesus said in John 6:26, I tell you the truth. You want to be with me because I fed you, not because you understood what the signs meant. Sometimes we want to follow God's gifts and worship his gifts rather than God himself who gives them. It's easy, to put down the Old Testament and say, oh, those guys worship gods of stone and gods of wood, and not realize that we worship gods of pixels and paper, gods of feelings and intoxications. Now, the question comes next, of course. There's Norma. Sorry I called you out while you were gone. We were talking about the tabernacle, and you weren't here to help me. So we come now to the question of these gods. Little g gods. Anytime there's an S on it, it has to be a little g, right? You follow the logic. It's got to be a little g if there's an S. So these gods, how powerful are they? And it takes us back to one of my top 3 Old Testament stories. Elijah and the prophets of Baal. You remember what happened. We're in the middle of a drought here, right? Everybody tells us we're in a drought. Everybody tells you don't notice until you drive across the lake. When you drive across the lake, you see we're in a drought. It's a multi-year drought, right? But it rained last week, and it's going to rain tomorrow. Sorry, Janine, but it's going to rain tomorrow. And so it's going to rain, and it rained, and yet we're in a drought. Keep in mind that Elijah's drought, 3 years, not one drop of rain on Israel. Can you imagine what your lawn would look like after 3 years of not one drop of rain? My parents moved to San Antonio in 1950, and they said when they got there, there was no grass anywhere. It was weird. It was just kind of this powdery brown dust, and they didn't have any grass. And my mother said that's weird, because then later she saw grass, and grass began to grow places, and it was just a cyclic drought. And when it came back in the 70s, there was no grass again. And it's a cyclic drought that just occurs. And those droughts are the kind of droughts you get some rain in. So I'm picturing my lawn. You know, it gets pretty crispy in the winter, right? So it gets really crispy. Imagine if you went through another whole summer with not one drop of rain, and you step on it, it just turned to dust, wouldn't it? And by the second year, your lawn wouldn't even have that, all blow away. You'd just have dirt. Third year would be really, really horrific. So along comes Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And we won't go through the whole lesson, but just know that this was a very dry time. I don't know if anybody here has ever gone camping in Pathfinders or in that other group called Boy or Girl Scouts and tried to start a fire in the rain. You know, you have to dig under something, right, Chuck? And you got to find something that's been sheltered, and then you have to shave it down a little bit to get it small, and then you have to get a match or whatever you're using to start fire and heat it up enough that it dries it out, and on and on and on. But you know, 3 years of not raining, Boy Scouts are in heaven, right? You can start that fire like that. Jiffy time, one spark, and the whole country's going up in flames, right? You go, hey man, this is easy. My desert camping experience is good because all I've got to do is find a spark, one. So here come the prophets of Baal, 800 and some prophets of Baal, and they're all praying and they're yelling and they're shouting and convulsing and cutting themselves, and the only thing that Baal has to do is one spark. Now there are a couple of levels I've always looked at that on, and one level is Baal must have been pretty lame if he couldn't come up with one spark. And the other is, if Baal is a placeholder for Satan, which I believe he was, Satan in the face of God is utterly powerless. Because the contest would never have gotten to the God part if the fire had started in the first part. Elijah let them go first. If there had been one spark, God never would have had a chance. Battle over. People know who to follow. So Satan, Baal, these little G gods cannot create one single spark. How powerful is a little G God? How much power does a little G God have? The answer is exactly as much power as you give him. Amen. And unfortunately, we give him a lot of power. The difference between worshiping God in heaven and worshiping little G gods is that we give the power to little G gods and God in heaven gives us the power. And it ought to work that way. So these little G gods on the Mount Carmel couldn't do anything. And then you remember the story ended that God burned up everything. He burned up things that can't be burned. So the question is, where are you deriving your worship? Let me give you a really good definition of an idol. Anything or anybody that we go to fill a need that God is designed to fill. Any need that God desires to fill for you, that you fill with something else, makes that something else an idol. I was in high school. I was thinking the other day, how many miles have I carried a French horn case? Oh my, miles and miles. And they're really hard to carry. I don't know if anybody here ever carried a French horn case. They got a flare on the end, and they're really inconvenient. They hit your knee every step. It's painful. It's ugly. I've carried French horn cases miles and miles and miles. And why? Because I love music? Oh, maybe a little bit. But really, I carried them because I found out that they gave me significance. When I was in junior high, I discovered that if you could play really well, you could get medals to wear on your lapel. And it was very cool to have medals. It was the very first time for me that I was able to create a situation where I was in the haves and y'all were in the have-nots. It was a good time when you could have 12 of those medals down this lapel. The coat hung kind of funny, but I loved it. And then I found out in high school they had patches for your jacket so you could wear them every day when it was cool enough, and sometimes even when it wasn't. And we'd wear these patches on our jacket. And the patches on the jacket signified more than the medals. The medals just meant you played well, but you could play, the colors meant a lot because you could play a really easy piece well, right? And you could get one of the white ones, but you really wanted the blue ones because that meant you really played well. And then these patches here were pretty good because they were zero-sum patches. To get the patch, you not only had to play well, you had to beat somebody else, right? So patches were like notches on your gun, because you beat somebody in a contest to get those patches. And that was really cool. And I'm going to tell you that I was definitely an idol worshiper in high school. And the idol was that whole self-significance of beating other people at competitions. And getting the patches to where there was no more room on the sleeves was utterly, utterly cool. A huge achievement. About which time you graduate, go to college, and every player in the college is as good as you. Which is really, really discouraging. But anyway, so you have to develop some other way, some other God to fill your significance bucket. And we do it throughout our lives, don't we? We figure out ways that we can be a little bit more have than the have-nots. That we can show ourselves or find our comfort. What are the gods in our lives? The gods in our lives include comfort, right? This is the American dream, we call it. What I'm looking for is vacations and retirement, and everything else is just something I have to do to get there, right? Some of you hate your jobs. I hear the laughing. We have a God of entertainment. How much are we doing to be entertained? You can't sit at home for 15 minutes and visit. You got to go to a movie, right? You got to watch something on TV. You got to play a game on your phone. We got to do something, right? We are addicted to entertainment. We're addicted to so many little g gods that fill little needs badly that God wants to fill well. And the question is, how do you know what your gods are? I'm going to give you 3 ways to know what your gods are. Way number 1, take out your checkbook or bring it up on the screen and see where your money goes. Money chases gods. Now, money itself may be the god, we'll see. But you go down and you see where your money's being spent, and you will see who your gods are. The second way you do it is you look at your calendar. If you look at your calendar, you'll see where you're spending your time and who your gods are. And the third way is to look at your daydreams. I remember I used to daydream when I was in school of hitting the home run. That was a big daydream for me. I wanted to be the sports hero. Imagine that. And I remember I never did hit a home run in all of my school days because the fence was just too far away. Have you been back to elementary school? It's not that far. It really isn't that far away. I was just a wimp. And so I couldn't hit it over the fence, so I dreamed about it all the time. I fantasized about it. Some people who are poor have the biggest problem with money being their God, right? They fuss about it all the time. If only I had, if only I could, if only, and it's just like me in the baseball, If only I could hit that home run. Dreams of vindication and justice. All these dreams that we have, these daydreams, tell us where our real worship is. Now, we talked a little bit first about a kind of a football game setting and everybody watching the game and being a little more excited than even maybe we are here today. Has anybody ever been to a football game? No, yeah. I once, when I was at SMU, the most exciting sports event I'd ever been to, I went to SMU and they had the natatorium is right there. It's not a very big natatorium as natatoriums go, but it's a beautiful old stone building. And it was packed. SMU versus Indiana. Indiana was a huge swimming powerhouse. And it came down to the last lap of the last leg of the last event, which was the 4x4 relay. And it was tied. So whoever got to that line first won the whole tournament. I have never heard such a loud noise. You know how natatoriums are anyway, they're kind of loud. Never heard such an exciting experience. It's hard to reproduce that at church. It really is. What I want us to do, though, is think about the rest of the universe. Everybody believe there are angels that we can't see? Everybody believe that there's spiritual warfare going on that we're unaware of? Okay. Me too. How about other beings besides angels? You think there are some of those out there? I think there are too. Can't promise it, can't guarantee it. Got some indications of it in some good writings, but okay. So, the whole universe is at the event. And they're watching long distance to see what's going to happen. Think about how the crowd sat around and watched the events of Eden. Will she take it? Will she leave it? Will she obey? Will she rebel? Imagine what happened when the first couple ate. Oh, what a defeat, right? Time goes on. There's 1,000 of them, but just think about the one where Abraham is asked. God says, go to a country I will show you. Get up and leave. Go to a country I will show you. Will he go? Will he not go? It's a pretty exciting time. Abraham starts to pack and the crowd starts to cheer, yeah? How many people do you think God made that offer to before Abraham? Maybe that said no. We'll never know here in the Bible because they didn't get a book written about them. So, on through the Bible, and then we get down to the events of AD 30-something. And here's Jesus in Gethsemane. Imagine the crowd watching that. Because this crowd knows Jesus. They know him personally. They're his guy. He's their guy. And he says, spare me from this. And they're on pins and needles. They're on the edge of their seat, aren't they? And all of a sudden he says, but not my will. And the cheers go up. And imagine on resurrection morning, they watch that scene. Can you imagine the cheers? All of heaven breaks loose like it's never broke loose before. The great drama of earth writ large has now been determined, but the war and the sport and the game and the watching is not yet over. The difference is that now instead of all of heaven watching to see Jesus' victory over Satan, all of heaven is looking at you and me to see what we will decide in our hearts. The contest for the vindication of good and the vindication of God and the vindication of heaven is being fought out inside your heart and mind today. And the universe is watching. Will we worship God or will we worship ourselves? That's the question it really comes down to. And so today, I'm going to ask you to let me have a special prayer for you. Will you let me pray for you as I pray for myself? Dear God in heaven, please help me to forsake all other gods, to forsake the God of self. Father, I know you've given us good things. You've given us people that we love, family, spouses. You've given us cars and homes. You've given us a church. You've given us so many wonderful things. Please help us to not turn those into gods, and if we've done so, to cast them away. We ask that you not just tear down the idols in our lives, but that you replace them with yourself. We raise you up onto the empty throne of our lives. And we ask you to be our one, only, jealous, and sufficient God. Please forgive us where we have gone after these other things, and bring us home to you, that today and tomorrow and for our eternity we might seek after you and you only and your righteousness. And then we ask that you'd add all those other things to us. Satisfy our hearts with your Spirit. Change us into the image of Jesus, we ask in his holy name. Amen.